Quote, H.L. Mencken, whom you call a prominent intellectual during the Progressive Era, quote, "It is apparent that the Negro, no matter how much he is educated, must remain, as a race, in a condition of subservience, that he must remain the inferior. Therefore, the effort to educate him has awakened in his mind ambitions and aspirations which, in the very nature of things, must go unrealized." Close quote. It's that phrase, in the very nature of things, yes, that gets to the view.
Yes, that was a pervasive view during that era.
And it is straightforward, pure racism in the strict sense of believing that the races are materially different from one another.
Yes. It's sort of hard to... One of the problems with this way of thinking is that it eternalizes a set of circumstances that exist at the moment. And when you realize how even a whole century is just a blink of an eye in the history of the human race, and when you realize, for example, that IQ tests have only existed for about a century and are by no means infallible, if you look back over the centuries and you see how the races that were on top at one time were now no longer on top. I mean, at one time, the Middle East was the leading civilization in the world. And before them, China, for even more centuries, was the leading civilization in the world. And even within Europe, it was precisely the Southern Europeans who were so much more advanced than the people in Britain or Scandinavia back in the days of
Greece and Rome.
Greece and Rome. But what the people of that era did was take the different achievements of different groups and sort of freeze them in stone as if there was no past and there would be no future.
As best I can tell from the book, the IQ tests, they believed that they actually had objective evidence. They had proof of the differences between races arising from these intelligence tests that began to be given around the time of the First World War.
Yes.
Where do these tests come from?
Well, different places. Some from Stanford, Terman, for example. But one of the people, Brigham, who was the author of the College Board Scholastic Aptitude Test, made the argument that these tests disprove the idea that Jews were very intelligent because they scored low on the Army mental test in the First World War. And now, 7 years later, he finally comes out and says, that admits that his conclusion was without foundation because many of the immigrants who took that test were raised in homes where people didn't speak English. They didn't look into the data on blacks, my gosh, the amount of education that blacks had at that time was pathetic, and the quality was even worse. So one of the ironies that I found in going through these things in detail was that if you look at the Army tests, that blacks did much worse on very easy questions that required a knowledge of words than on much more difficult questions that did not. And so, for example, the questions were, tell which of the following are opposites. And they had things like black and white, night and day, up and down. And blacks got wiped out on those tests. And the reason is that how many of them knew what the word opposite meant at that point?
Right.
But the other tests, for example, required you to look at pictures of stacks of blocks, including some blocks you couldn't see, but which you had to infer from the shape of the stack and count them. And blacks didn't do nearly as badly on those tests.
Got it. You also note that certain cultural groups scored especially low on abstract reasoning. It's not just African Americans. It's also Gaelic speakers in the Scottish Hebrides. It's Indians in South Africa. It's working class children in rural England. It's lower class youngsters in Venezuela. It's a particular culture that is perhaps too poor to have the time, as it were, or the intellectual resources to devote to abstract reasoning.
I would look at it somewhat differently.
You would?
I would say that very often we try to explain, for example, why the Irish didn't do as well as the English. And the real question is, the real fact is that the Irish were much more typical of people around the world than were the English. And the real question is, why did the English do so much better?
Why was there an industrial revolution on one island and not on the other?
That's right. And I think the same thing here, that if you go far enough back in history, I suspect you'll find that most of the human race had no interest in abstractions. And so the question becomes, certain kinds of cultures do have a desire to get into abstractions, and that becomes an enormous advantage to them. But I wouldn't try to explain why the others didn't do it, because the others were unfortunately what the majority of the people are like in the world, even today.
All right.